Good afternoon, everyone. Who would have thought that 18 months into the pandemic and companies are taking point over each other from a technology perspective? The speed and the adoption of digital technologies has actually transformed by several years. And the businesses forever have now started to contribute to the emerging new pattern of cashless, contactless operation. Who would have ever thought about this era 18 to 20 months ago? The digital lending platform enables the fintech to access data early and help it processing data quickly, taking faster decisions, speed to market is increasing. With this ongoing data and digital transformation, AI, machine learning can actually take this to a new level by actually identifying some of the fraudulent transactions. And digital workforce is actually a critical enabler for all of these changes. And hence, technology, talent, workforce put together is actually leading to successful transformation. Good afternoon once again, my fellow panelists. It's really an honor to be moderating such an esteemed panel with you. Let me start with you, Adhil. When you got this invite, right, and you see what's happening in the entire Indian ecosystem from an account aggregator perspective, what were your initial thoughts?
Let me take that. So I think account aggregator is very topical. A lot of news covering it in the last week's time. Very quickly, right? I think it's a story in three parts, Jaspreet. In 2016, the RBI released the account aggregator license. Brilliant idea. Basically gives the consent and the control to the customer to control their data, saying you can provide consent in a secure architecture to share data from your bank to where you're applying a loan for, and it's all managed basis consumer consent. It took 5 years for it to launch. Last week it has launched. 8 banks have said that they're going live on it. Stage 2, everything is looking good. Now stage 3 is what we enter now. In a network, power comes when every single bank is in it, when other regulated entities are in it, and that's what needs to happen in the next 3 to 6 months. We need everyone coming on board. We needed to open up to other regulated entities, and we needed to open up credit flow using an open, secure data architecture.
I think great 3 points, right? I think the policy is now there. Let's see who it gets implemented on ground, and what are the various steps that government puts in to regulate some of these pieces. I think that's going to be very, very important. Mr. Srikanth, coming over to you, right? With this entire, account aggregators coming in and the enormous data that's going to be made available, right? And they would, process some of these data. What are your thoughts on how critical it is to look at this entire data set with one lens? I think you are on mute, sir.
Sorry, can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
So I was saying that India has been going through a massive digital transformation with the advent of Aadhaar, which we launched about 8 to 10 years ago now. And then you had UPI, which did 3.5 billion transactions last month. And now you have OCEN and the flow-based lending platform. So what you're seeing is India becoming a data-rich nation. So how do we use this in order to improve the lives of people, in order to offer credit to a large number of people, whether it's SMEs, whether it's personal loans, whether it is small loans for vendors and other businesses and so on. So I think this account aggregator framework allows us to do that in a well thought through way in which data privacy is not compromised. So, while US has been fairly, cavalier about privacy, and we ended up with identity players, which are largely the large, Facebooks and Google. I think with the right kind of regulation, you can not only deal with data privacy of the individual, but also empowerment of the individual using data, which is what OCEN and flow-based lending are about. So I think people, especially small businesses, individual borrowers, and so on, can benefit by using their digital footprint. Increasingly, we have an enormous amount of digital footprint through our smartphones, through our transactions, and so on. And if they are able to get loans based on that digital footprint, OKN and flow-based lending would be very important. Secondly, today, the data, although it is supposedly owned by the end consumer, the custodians of the data are the banks and other big businesses. Account aggregator framework sort of unbundles this, opens up the value to the end consumer so that the consumer has control over this data to say, bank ABC, where I have my account, please give the information of my track record on bank statements and my lending and other data of mine to this fintech or another bank in order to get a loan at the right rate. I think this is what it unleashes. And as Adhil said, it's wonderful. 8 banks have already jumped on board this bandwagon. And I think it's going to open up what we saw in identity with Aadhaar, what we saw with UPI on payments. I think we're going to see on lending with OKN and account aggregator. Okay.
So you think it's going to usher in the next wave of revolution from a lending perspective? Very, very important. Mr. Anand, I would be right. We've seen, Mr. Srikanth mentioned Aadhaar, UPI. It's constant, and now the account aggregator. There is constant innovation that is happening. But how would companies ensure that, right, they keep innovating while, as well as from a fintech perspective, keep delivering value also, right? How do you balance between innovation and value?
Yeah, so I think innovation is coming, and it's coming at speed, right? A few years ago when we started in India, I still remember that analytics was still early. I think people looked at reporting as analytics. I think today, most of fintechs, native born and cloud companies are leveraging technologies to levels that we feel are still very early, but have a huge way to go. Our mission is to help people see and understand data. Now, that data could reside with a fintech, or it could reside even with the customer, or regulatory authorities. So a lot of what I see happening as we go forward is that increased use of AI and ML to actually do a whole bunch of predictive analytics. We see the market itself evolving. We see more technology coming in, and we see all companies in this space leveraging whatever latest technologies they have, their business insights, their business knowledge to actually drive the whole business forward, at least in the fintech space. And I think it's really exciting times from an analytics and a AI ML perspective for the industry.
Superb. I think great thoughts on AI ML, and an exciting time really indeed. Now, I think if you're in the fintech or in the tech industry, this is probably the best time to be here and now and to do a lot of innovation. So, Yogi, we've seen that digital banking, it is actually requires different kind of skill sets. Right? What are your thoughts on what should we do from a talent perspective? Do you think there is a shortage from a skills perspective? Do some of the initiatives that the government is running on the national skills pieces, helping, etc. What are your thoughts from somebody who's running such a large, organization?
Sure, Jaspreet. Thanks for that question. So look, all of these new technologies are new for India as well, and that's the reason that there's a huge gap between the supply and the demand. Also, over the last 12 to 18 months, there's a lot of dollars which are chasing these startups, which are in fintechs, edtechs, new age companies. So what it has created is that there's a huge gap between the demand side, where the new companies, the new startups, the new age technology companies are looking out for tech-based talent who can help them into the likes of the comments which Mr. Anand made about the AI ML, a piece of it, and the entire growth on the credit side, which the fintechs have been largely responsible for over the last 2 to 3 years. So you have a supply side which is coming out from the colleges, especially the top tier colleges which are kind of incubating these kind of courses into their curriculum. And then on the other side, you have experienced people out there who are trying to learn more things about the new technologies. But the demand is much higher than the supply. So obviously there's a big gap between what we need as an industry versus what is coming out from the schools and colleges at this time. And with so many dollars chasing the startups, it had the demand continues to grow. And till the time I think the existing talent pool out there can get upskilled with the new technologies out there, you'll continue to see challenges in terms of hiring these people and maintaining these people as well. So I believe from a skill standpoint where we are, there's a bit of a disequilibrium caused by certain demand and the supply not being shaping up as much as the industry would have wanted to be at this point.
But that will always be the case, right? I'll come to that in a minute. But the demand supply problem, right? Whether it is 1990, late 90s, I think 2000, the dot-com supply demand issue, or now the fintech data-driven new technologies, AI, that I think that will always. But thanks for making such an excellent point, Mr. Sanjay. Right? How can we accelerate and transform this entire digital workforce in the current times, right? One is the speed at which we are going. Every 2-3 years, we try to innovate, we bring in technologies. How can we accelerate this entire process?
Thank you, Jaspreet. I think it's an excellent question that while on one side there is a bit of a equilibrium in the demand and supply, there is a need to accelerate the supply side. And there are many ways of doing it. And I think 2 or 3 things which typically hinder rapid adoption of digital. One is that the organization should have a culture that encourages and supports the digital first thinking or looking at digital processes in a different manner, which means that you should be willing to experiment with things. You should be willing to take risks, allow people to take risks, etc. So there's a culture piece that is clearly needed. And the second is that one has to be very clear on what skills do we really need. So whether it's the mobile app development skill or a big data science skill that we're talking of, whether it's creating of bots or fintech models or using data aggregation itself. And that depends on the top sort of customer you are servicing. So being customer centric is another important ask when you look at digital scaling. And I think different shoes will fit different people. For example, for us, we look at servicing the underserved or excluded or unorganized micro enterprises. And here the need is very different. It is not that I can use the data aggregation that aggregator would give me. I need non-financial data. So I need things like what is the utility payment of the customer? How can I analyze it? How can I use cluster-based information? So each company will find what their customer really needs and how can we solve the problem for them? And therefore, what sort of skills do we need and develop those skills? So I would list culture building and looking at customers and figuring out what skills you want as 2 very important starting points.
Super. But thanks, Mr. Rajeev, you've given me a clue into my next question on the importance of data. Mr. Rajeev, last but not the least, I think probably one of the most important pieces is that we are talking about a paradigm shift in the entire technology, right? And we're talking about a global era of digitization. How important is data's role in improving value, increasing efficiency, and so on and so forth?
Thanks, Jaspreet. So I was listening to the speakers, and I think there's some very interesting points that have been raised. I think when we look at data, and given that data is sort of new to the Indian tech industry, Indian tech industry has been more used to development of applications or development of middleware or systems. I think the first aspect that around which sensitivity has to come is the purpose behind the data. What in a specific field, meaning when you talk about data, of course, there are a lot of individual fields, but ultimately, hopefully behind those individual fields, there was a purpose for capturing those. And that is a very important one. And sometimes it may seem very obvious, but that is actually the hardest area for people to understand what is a purpose and come up with a uniform, normalized understanding of that purpose. The second aspect, I think, which is very tricky and it's sometimes deal with fundamental computer science problems, is the provenance of data. Because like, for example, in account aggregation also, there are multiple banks, each bank is aggregating data, is collecting data and putting it onto this. What is the real true source? What do you consider as authentic? You know, if there are three names that get captured, one with a slightly different spelling from the other, what is the real provenance of data? What is the real origin of the data? Becomes a very, very tricky problem. And that is where the second aspect of value lies, because if the integrity of data, not from a security perspective, but integrity of data from an accuracy perspective gets compromised and the value collapses. And the third aspect, which of course, I think our co-panelist, Mr. Anand, would be better be able to answer, is the visualization. I think that's one of the hardest problems, if you ask me, besides provenance and purpose, is the visualization. Because as people who have come more from systems, middleware, application layers, we are more used to visualizing data in a very flat manner. And that's where a problem arises, because if you visualize it flat, your ability to gain insights, your ability to create value out of it also becomes flat. And what we call today as a lot of analytics or MIS and all is actually stuff that probably a tool can do in a second. So the real value of data will come when your visualization is throwing back things which are not obvious inside it, or which cannot be inferred. It is like 5 fields come together and infer a 6th field, which was never thought of earlier. So that is, I think, the third area. So I would say that, you know, this value has 3 dimensions: provenance, it has the purpose, and then it has visualization. If the 3 of these collect together, then probably the data can become extremely valuable for multiple kinds of use cases.
Superb. Thank you, Mr. Rajeev. I think I've never had a more exciting panel where one panelist gives cue for me to go to the next panelist, right? We started with skills, moved into Mr. Sanjay, talked about data, moved to Mr. Rajeev, and now coming to Mr. Anand, right? Mr. Rajeev has already given a cue, right? How important, with so much of data being available, right? Everybody is seeing that small video which says that in 1 minute on the internet, you have some 2.5 million Instagram likes, you know, one Aadhaar card is generated every 7 minutes, things and so on and so forth. How important is data visualization, right? And from that perspective, how can companies make use of terabytes of data that Mr. Anand, over.
Okay, sorry. I actually want to touch on a couple of points Rajeev and Sanjay has raised. I think before I answer yours, I completely agree, right? If the data has issues, then whatever you visualize is going to have very little value. So I think a couple of things that I've, when I speak to leaders, and especially fintech, by the way, is probably a little ahead of some of the other, ancillary segments that exist here. And the reason for that is just the speed at which they work is probably very different compared to some of the traditional financial service industries. Okay. Now, coming to a couple of things, right? One, around culture. So when I always speak, I talk about the fact that the dashboard or whatever the report that you look at is not going to drive any great change in the way an organization runs, right? It's actually a historic analysis or a report of what's already happened. I think that the actual fact is, how do we as leaders build a culture of data within our own people, right? And it's not about the developer who's building an app, and it's not about the consumer who consumes the content, but it's really using data as the core to every decision that you take. Now, and that's where I think all the other technology comes in, right? So you can throw bots at it, you write great algos that make sure that half a dozen things can be speeded up. But in reality, I still feel that gap, and I think a lot of the panelists have brought that up, right? There is there is all of us know utopian scenario where we want to be, right? Hey, this is what we'd love, everything from a system. We know that the gaps are there. When it comes to skills, right? And here are things that are happening, right? I think there are two problems. There's a skill issue obviously at the school, college level, and I know a lot of things are being done to fix that, right? When it comes to using data, but I also feel the skill deficit exists within companies themselves, right? We're used to a traditional way of working. Our decision making has been ad hoc or opinion based. Now, how do you move that and get people to embrace decision making based on culture, which will actually drive, I think, businesses, companies, decisions forward? So I think there's so much around this piece at the moment that is happening. There's the technology piece, there's the people piece, and then there's this whole, how do you create blueprints for success that people can replicate? So I would, put it back to the panel, and anybody would like to look at saying that I'm sure you all are facing these challenges, and what are the things that you might be doing to even address this? Might be interesting to know.
Okay. Thanks for those lovely pieces of information, Mr. Anand. Mr. Srikanth, coming to you, right? We've been talking about fintechs, right? But fintechs cannot, along with all the data that they generate, cannot alone sustain. What do you think are the key success factors for the collaboration between fintech and various other financial institutions?
Good question. For instance, we've been talking about credit. We've not found many fintechs being very successful in growing a successful credit portfolio. We've talked about AI, we've talked about mobile apps. Fintechs are excellent at cutting edge technology. They've created amazing apps. They've created perhaps AI models and so on, but still you don't see large AUM growth with good stable NPAs as you see in some of the larger banks. So what is it that fintechs can do better, and where is it that the banks can also benefit from this collaboration that you're talking about? The banks on the other side are large, sort of slow, traditional, conservative, not agile with technology, using probably 20, 30-year-old technology with 2 levels of indirection, core banking provider, a systems integrator trying to build. Before you know it, you're 2 levels away from the customer and you don't control the customer. So these are the challenges on either side. One can help the other. The banks need a new digital platform in order to provide financial services at the touch of a button on a smartphone, anytime, anywhere. Fintechs seem to know how to do it. They're agile, they're hungry. They've proven that they've created amazing products in the Indian ecosystem. So I think there is a huge value for bringing the agility, the innovation, the drive that the fintechs have, and work with the banks, which actually understand credit, okay, which understand collections, which understand credit rating models. Perhaps they have not jumped into AI yet in a large way, but putting these two sort of cultures together in a constructive way can, I think, provide a huge value. It can grow, we can lend to a large section, especially when you look at today's, we discussed AA, account aggregator, we discussed OKEN and so on, especially in the flow-based lending world, where you're going more to unsecured small loans, to SMEs, personal loans, where data is going to become very important. I think this collaboration between fintechs and banks is going to become, I think, extremely important, and it can, increase the pace of taking these products and services out there much faster. Just one last piece, there was a discussion around AI. I just want to share, that while AI models are being used in some economies, I have yet to see a large, credit portfolio using AI models successfully. So what it needs is a lot more data and models driven by that data. If we don't want to go through all the exploratory data analysis and feature engineering that is required in order to actually get through good models without breaking the bank with large NPAs, You might, I've seen a lot of companies, especially in the US, go through deep learning, so you don't have to do feature engineering. So there are ways to get around it without having to take an enormous risk in the beginning when your models are still, sort of stabilizing. There's also the issue of model drift. We've seen, at Novopay, we have created this ML workbench where we have looked at very large data sets and modeled it. There certainly is a huge value in taking AI-based credit models, especially when you have a large digital exhaust. But you need to be sophisticated enough to do the EDA right, the feature engineering right, be able to watch the model drift and bringing back so that you don't, your NPS don't go through the roof. Back to you, so Jaspreet. Oh, okay.
So, Mr. Srikanth, we should have a chat about the topics that you just brought out. In fact, some of the things that you mentioned about using AI for credit and how sometimes maybe you may not have encountered companies which have built large credit books based on these algorithms. I think there are some companies which are out there, including ourselves, who've been doing some fairly good job in terms of our AUM growth, in terms of our reduction of our credit, and how we have tried to look at all of this alternate data using deep AI ML algorithms, and how we have been able to solve it. I think could be a new data point for ourselves. So maybe let's talk through about it, because look, there's a lot of devil in the detail, and some of the comments that you made, I think some of us have kind of crossed through that level.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
That's good to hear. Since Jaspreet is not here, maybe what we can, perhaps we can ask Adhil about the new digital loan app. The RBI has set up a working group. Adhil, your thoughts on this digital loan app and how it might get regulated by the central bank? You wanna go? Is Adhil there? And anybody else? Rajeev, you want to take that? Talk a little bit about the digital loan app that RBI is talking about, the working group?
No, I don't really have any understanding in that, but happy somebody else wants to take it on.
Oh, okay. Jaspreet is back. Jaspreet's back to you.
Apologies, I just got disconnected. So yes, I was going to speak, talk to Anand on the digital app. But I think let's give it a pass. Let's go to either one of you, Mr. Yogi or Mr. Sanjay, and talk about the quality of data. Right, we've spoken so much about data, but what are the challenges your organizations are facing in improving the quality of data from looking at amount of data that is being generated?
Yes, I think. I completely agree with what Rajeev sometime mentioned, that the first thing is to get the right data and get quality data. And I think if I may just use a small anecdotal information there, when we started lending to micro enterprises, and these are people who don't have credit history, so you don't really typically lend the way banks lend, that they ask you your credit score or they look at your balance sheet, etc. These people don't have balance sheets either. And we started by first saying that before we start using data for either visualizing, and we do use some of the tools that Anand's company provides us, I think we started by saying that let's collate that data in a form that will be usable. And I think that comes to that point that Rajeev made, that you should know what data you want. And if you can start building that, you can come to a stage where you can start using that data. Today, we have given loans to 300,000 micro enterprises. And that may not be a scale that Mr. Srikanth mentioned about, but it's still a reasonable scale for artificial intelligence and machine learning to be applied. And just about a few years back, we started using machine learning and artificial intelligence. So the summary of this anecdotal information is that data is important, and often people rush in to say that whatever data is available, let me put it into a black box and see if some wonderful results come out. Life is not that simple. In life, you have to think what exactly are the data points that you want. And if they're not there, you have to develop them. And in India, you have to develop most of the data points. So on one piece, I think there's a problem where existing customers who have used credit services, they have to be served better and their data points are available and an aggregator will have. But there's a very large segment of population like the micro enterprises, unorganized micro enterprises where data doesn't exist. And someone has to start saying that what data is important. So if you ask me, I'll say that I want to know what the utility payments are like, or and which I don't find any discussion in most forums. So I think the important thing is to understand that what data will make sense to you and go after that. It's a slow journey. It's not very rapid. In months you start finding wonderful data, but it is doable, and India has done very well on that. I think I will leave it at that, and maybe Rajeev can add to that. But I think data quality is something that we have to take ownership of.
I totally agree. Right? If you today see the various databases that exist on a national level, for every individual you can get a big file, but how much of the data is accurate? How much you can rely on the integrity of the data? And multiple data sets for a single individual are also very, very common, right? Because sometimes you use full name, sometimes you just write your half name or various aliases, right? And it all changes the micro dynamics of it. Excellent one. Mr. Rajeev, over to you. Now that we're talking about so much of data, right? We spoke about the amount of data being generated. Do you think data literacy is important?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think data literacy is it relates very closely to your ability to use data, and I think it's probably one of the hardest problems that you have sort of pointed towards, because it requires you to move away from the number or the value that is staring at you, to understanding behind it, where has it come from, what does it mean, what does it relate to, and it's tricky. Data literacy is something which, if you look at it even from schools, at a school level also, it's not something which is really taught to us. It's not something which is sort of imbibed into us. It is forced into us to do that. And that becomes a big problem as you sort of, start depending more and more upon data. I'll give you a simple example. All of us are very used to looking at data and then taking decisions, which is what I think Mr. Anand and Srikanth also talked about. But that is that really the power of data? That is conventional stuff. That is, what analytics was all about. Saying that you look at data, there is some decision that you can take because you're a smart chap. You have lots of experience out there. The real power of data comes when you figure out how, using that data, another machine can take an automated decision. Now that becomes tricky, because there you need to understand the power of the data. You also need to understand the quality of the data. You need to understand when the decision can go wrong, when the decision can go right, and you're leaving the system to go ahead and do it, right? You are saying that no human being will be involved. I may have governance principles around it, but no human being. That's very tricky. The other aspect of data that comes into play is that I think Mr. Sanjay was talking about quality. Sure. So, a lot of quality will be missing. But if you triangulate multiple data aspects about one particular purpose, can you infer the true value, right? Now that requires data literacy. Like if there are three names, but the three people, one person seems to be having shopped in Mumbai very often, the other person has shopped in Pune very often, and the third person seems to have shopped in Hyderabad very often, right? And can you relate to this and say, hey, look, the first two seem to be the same, but the third one is not, even though the name and many other fields were the same. So that requires, again, literacy of a different kind. So it's the inference behind it which becomes tricky.
Perfect. So let me come to Mr. Yogi then. He would be facing same problem day in and day out in his organization. So how do you deal with some of the issues around data literacy? And then we'll come to Mr. Anand looking for solutions, right? On how do we solve this problem?
Yeah, so I think both Mr. Sanjay and Rajeev have given some very important cues for this conversation. So look, in fintech, people sometimes talk about that for every customer they have 500 data points, 1,000 data points. Somebody says, I have 2,000 data points as well. But if you ask yourself that, do you know as much as about yourself? Sometimes the answer is no, right? So for every person, you do collect information. It could be a mobile-based information. It could be your app-based information. This is the information that you get from the bureaus. And at the end of the day, you have to look at that, how much of this data and what part of this information is relevant for you for the decision making. And then you create the layers of that information into your decision making process through an algorithm, and figure out that what has the most amount of uniqueness from a decision making standpoint from this data. So look, so as a company, we are always very data hungry, and I think the entire industry, which is fintechs and beyond, the fintechs as well, have become very data hungry. But every time when a company is exposed to information or data, you have to step back and figure out that out of this information, what is relevant and what is not relevant. It is good to talk about 2,000 data points, 5,000 data points, and all the fancy numbers which are out there. But the organization has to step back and say that out of these 500 data points, 1,000 data points that you capture, what is relevant and what's not relevant. So I think that's one. Secondly, I think there were some amazing comments which were spoken about the quality of the information and how much you can depend on that information to start with. There could be confusions created with the names, with other issues on the quality which is out there. So I think once you have taken a view, and I think Mr. Sanjay also mentioned a very good point, that it is a very slow process. You can't take decisions around it from month 1, month 2, month 3. You have to go through the grind of figuring out that out of the data that you collect, what is relevant and what is not. And maybe in 6 months, 12 months, the machines and these algorithms starts to become more and more relevant in your lives. And then then there is a tipping point when they start making sense in your lives. It is not a process that you will break through on day 1 or day 30. I think it takes time to figure out that out of the data that you collect, what's relevant, filter out the data which is not, make sure that the information that you collect has some basic quality and hygiene associated to it. On month 6, month 9, month 12, whatever is the tipping point for the organization, when you've collected that much data and the trends on the information, I think that's the pivoting point where all of this information starts to make sense, and you can start relying on it to take critical decisions. I think there's no real shortcut behind this.
Okay. So if there is no shortcut behind this, let's go to Mr. Anand, who will tell us what the tipping point is and how do we look at making sense of this vast amount of information or data that is available out there. Mr. Anand, over to you.
I think the first thing is I doubt if there's perfect information, right? We know that. I think in 5 years' time, if we're all sitting on the same panel, we'll still be talking data and how much there is and how much there isn't. So I completely relate to a lot of stuff, right? I know that there is data being generated in the fintech industry today. 5 years later, with all the deep learning that will happen, I think there will be even more smarter technology which will be available for us to help take decisions. Having said that, I think two things, right? Data literacy is different for different people. It's different for different organizations. It's completely different for different skill sets. So I believe that culturally as a country, as we start to, kind of push data and use of data through the school and the college curriculum, we'll see a much better set of people come through the system in the next few years who will be more literate about how they approach, business problems and solutions. The technology piece is always going to evolve, and we all know that, right? And there's so much out there. We probably, as leaders, you all need to choose what to spend your time on and not what to spend your time on. And as business providers, for us, when we work with our customers, the most important thing that we do is tell them, hey, let's focus and make sure that you get what you think is absolutely necessary, and do not try and boil the ocean. Every time we go around this boil the ocean story, you will always end up, creating more problems for yourself. The good news is that with all of us trying to go find solutions around our business problems, there is a requirement for more data to be generated or more data to be analyzed. And these leads to different work streams, right? You could have work streams on if somebody's lending to farmers, you want to bring in weather data and you want to bring in a whole bunch of stuff. There is there are platforms and solutions that are available today to do this. I just feel that we need to make sure that we focus on what is important, work with that, at the same time, keep looking out to see what is relevant as we go forward. So my 2 bits on solutions and after being so long in the industry, yeah.
Super, super. Mr. Srikanth, as closing comments from your side, if I were to lay down 2 or 3 top key success areas for some of these successful implementations of data-driven architecture, what would that be?
Well, I mean, if you're asking in general across the board, of course, a lot of the AI's predictive power has been tested well against vision-based systems. So there's a ton of good examples in the healthcare industry for oncology and cardiology and so on, where vision-based systems have shown an incredible amount of sort of use. In the BFSI and the financial services itself, of course, credit rating comes as a obvious choice, especially given this sort of data exhaust. So several companies, I mean, right now, like Yogi mentioned and Sanjay mentioned, and I think Rajeev as well, that there's a lot of good examples within the country of credit rating and loan portfolios based on sophisticated AI models that are working. The large banks, I don't see them yet. They're testing, there are pilots happening, but I can tell you, being on the board of the HDFC Bank, I can tell you from a large bank perspective, I don't see a big chunk, 50%, 70%, 80% of loan portfolios yet being used, using these approaches. So I think, like all the other members have said, it'll take a little bit of time for this, sort of new technology to sort of mature and become mainstream. But I think the approach of sort of digital India, whether it is Aadhaar, whether it is OCAN, whether it's UPI and so on, are certainly driving us in that direction. And I think this panel has some excellent examples of where data has been used effectively for credit rating and other financial services. So I don't have specific, I'm sure in the broader AI area, there's enormous amount of examples, but I think perhaps here we have some examples of people who are created good portfolios using AI predictive credit rating models.
Perfect. Thank you. Mr. Adhil, we missed you. So let me ask you a question, right? The new digital loan app that's being launched, right? What are your thoughts about that? How significant a step is that in the entire fintech industry?
I think what's driving change here is consumer behavior, and that consumer behavior has rapidly changed during COVID. I think Sanjay said this earlier, Srikanth alluded to it. The consumer is saying that they want things fully electronically. They want things contactlessly. They're not willing to submit multiple pieces of documentation, multiple pieces of identity. Now, if they want that kind of service, how can we underwrite that quantum of risk, but with handling data electronically and via various digital delivery systems? So I think that's where it becomes very interesting, saying that very clearly the consumer has moved. And what would have happened in 3 years has now happened, in literally 3 quarters, because the consumer wants their digital loan product contactless. They're saying, I want this from my own bank, but I also want this from a new bank I'm applying to, or I want it from a new NBFC. I think the challenge between the banks, the fintechs, the account aggregator framework, I think the issue now is how do we all come together to make this happen for the consumer? Because the consumer is clear what they want. The question is, how do we come together, collaborate, figure out saying, managing the bank's strengths, which are, like Srikanth said, risk, like Srikanth said, collections, balance sheet, and also managing the fintech strengths, right? Like technology, customer acquisition, awareness of digital brand. How do we collaborate to deliver a digital loan experience, which is a win-win, both for the consumer and also for the lender.
Perfect. I think great closing remarks from you, Mr. Srikanth and Mr. Adhil. With this, I've been getting messages from the organizers. We reached the time limit. It was an excellent panel discussion. I clearly learned a lot from account aggregator to the digital loan app to how 5 years from now, even if we're doing the same panel, we'll still be talking about the data visualization part and what do we do with tons of data. To Mr. Yogi, Mr. Sanjay, Mr. Rajeev talking about the uses of data, what is possible, the art of possible from an AI/ML perspective. And obviously, Mr. Anand, thank you for talking about the entire visualization story and how it does value add for fintechs and the larger organization. Thank you so very much. It was indeed a real privilege moderating such an esteemed panel. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.